Our next speaker is Dr. Bruce Kingsbury. He's from Purdue University Fort Wayne, and he's going to be talking about the ecology and conservation of the Blandings turtle in Michigan. So I'm really excited for this talk. I'm excited to learn more about Blandings. So thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. Elizabeth Coverly, I've added her as a colleague here. She's part of the turtle team up in northern Michigan, and she helped me a lot with getting some of these materials ready. So Bruce Kingsbury, I'm from the Environmental Resources Center at Purdue University Fort Wayne, talking to you about Blandings turtle ecology and conservation today. As long as I can get the slides to go. Yeah, there we are. So a little bit of background about the species. They are in the Amidids, along with some of the familiar species like hooters and sliders and that kind of thing. They feed mostly on crustaceans and snails and other invertebrates. That the range as shown in the map there is pretty extensive. There are populations over in New England and then around the Great Lakes and over into Nebraska. They are on the radar for federal listing, but in as far as I know, everywhere they occur, they're afforded some sort of protection already. So for today, what I'd like to do is start off with a review of the Blandings turtle biology. And so now you're all experts on that, so that's done. And then jump into a little bit about habitat preferences, and then a little bit about patterns of movement. And as I do those, what I'd like to do is just pull out some key ecological findings, and also what that might lead us to in terms of conservation guidance. And the way I framed the talk today, there's an old study that we did actually in the 90s in northern Indiana, and just next to Michigan, in habitat that I think you'll agree that's very similar to many areas of southern Michigan. And then we have newer work that we've been doing in northern Michigan, up in the upper lower peninsula. And those are the two studies sites that I'm drawing some of the material for you today. So first, habitat associations. Got to do some pretty pictures of different kinds of habitats, but kind of the opening messages on this is that the kind of habitats that you find them in are actually quite diverse. You could have open water, emergent wetlands, forested, ephemeral wetlands. This is actually a wetland in the foreground. You might be able to see a little bit of water there. Here's an area with poison sumac and cattails and sedges and grasses and that kind of thing. Moving north, unless you missed some of the conifers here, you might think that you were still in southern Michigan. But what I hope you start to see is that in many ways, even whether you're talking about southern Michigan or northern Michigan, there's a lot of commonalities in terms of structure. The thing that I would add to the north are the conifers, also sandy soils to the north, and river habitat that I would think is less common as you go further south, but they are active in small streams. So here's a blast from the past. This is data from a spotted turtle, Blandings turtle study we did quite some time ago, and in the mid 90s. And basically, I'm using this slide to introduce a couple of things. One is in this data that I'm going to report to you, we were able to get adult Blandings turtles, teenagers, and in some of the sites we also had a handful of turtles that were only 2 or 3 years old. I won't really be talking about that here. We also did spotted turtles, And I did not try to extract that. I think you might also find that interesting as well. But I'm going to try to draw out some points for you about what we observed in this work. And in this study, we had these wetlands here surrounded by an agricultural forest matrix around it. And the first thing that stood out, and that should have stood out from all of the images that I showed you before, is that in terms of availability versus usage, emergent habitats are predominant, not only for the spotted turtles that we studied, but also the different age classes of the Blandings turtle. And so in terms of open water or terrestrial habitats or that sort of thing, they were not used nearly as much as the emergent wetlands were. Now, if we tease what we mean by emergent apart, we pull it across a spectrum, and what I'm trying to suggest here is to the left is the shallower systems, and over to the right, open water, lily pads, those sorts of things are really open water and getting out until there is no emergent vegetation. And that this work, I think, was very, very illustrative. The adult Blandings turtles, ABT, occupy all these sorts of areas. They're pretty eclectic in where you find them. And but as you go to the smaller turtles, you go talk about the juvenile turtles, you don't find them so much out in the areas that are more open water. You tend to find them in these habitats that are shallower water and are associated with those types of vegetation. And with, although it's on some of the other study areas that we did, when we do actually have the youngest Blandings turtle, they're only showing up in mostly in these cattail sedge mixes. Now that's interesting because it's about different kinds of emergent vegetation, but really what that relates to, not only in terms of the plants, but in terms of the animals, is the depth of the water. And so we studied very small Blandings turtles to very large Blandings turtles, and there's a very nice linear relationship between the depth of the water and the size of the turtle. Now, each one of these points is the average depth for a turtle that was observed many, many times, 20, 30, 40 times. So it's not individual observations, it's actually averages for individual turtles. And the spotted turtles in red fall on the same line. And so if you look at this, the really small turtles are in very shallow water. They're not out there in very deep water, but the pattern continues. And if I can draw your attention to the averages for the largest turtles, we're still only talking about half a meter in water depth. And so one of the things to really appreciate about these animals is that they're really only in very shallow water almost all the time. It's a digression, but it's worth noting that the Blandings turtle adults can be in flashier systems where the water level is changing a bit, but you don't see juvenile turtles in those environments, and you don't see spotted turtles in those environments. So there's another element of the stability of the water level. Another issue with respect to habitat selection is it at the microhabitat level or is it at the macrohabitat level? Is the animal fine-tuning where it is, and that tells you what kind of habitat they need, or are they pretty much selecting a larger suitable area, a macro habitat, and then being less selective in that way? And this is a principal components study from Rain Sovey's work up in northern Michigan, which I think illustrates a point about that, which is that if we have two principal components, principal one, the first one is about the lower values are more tree canopy and you go over to the higher values and it's more open water, less tree canopy, that kind of thing. And then on the second principal component, it's more about shrub structure is pretty predominant there. Is it bigger, larger shrubs or smaller shrubs? And what we see a little bit of is there that it's not the principal component, the second one that's so important. What we're really finding is that the turtles are tending towards areas that are more open, that still have some vegetative cover, but less in terms of tree canopy. Now that said, this type of analysis just feeds into a larger regression analysis, and what that reveals is that even though these come apart a little bit, they're pretty similar, and actually it suggests that the habitat choice is not being done at the microhabitat level, but at the macrohabitat level. So here's a wetland in Indiana, and you can read on the bottom there the different categories of turtle in there. But what I want you to just appreciate is that you have different ontogenetic size, different turtles, and they're clustering in terms of different locations in the same wetland. And what this shows, and also what looking at across wetland complexes shows us, is that the different sizes of turtles, just like I showed you on that graph before, are using different habitat. And if you don't have all those different kinds of habitat available to your individuals over time and to the population as a whole, you're not actually going to support recruitment and have a viable population. Another thing to point out from this work is that what you should see here from these minimum convex polygons is that they span multiple wetlands, and the turtles are actually using numerous different wetlands over any particular year. And so they're not, you might be able to find a Blandings turtle in one wetland, but actually in terms of a functioning population, they're active across a landscape of multiple wetlands. The other thing is that there's a lot of nodes here on these polygons that over in this area, and the spotted turtles actually tended to overwinter in some very shallow specific areas in this wetland, and the Blandings turtles over here and over here. And so an important element there is that they might overwinter in areas that are themselves special compared to the rest of the area. The other thing to begin to highlight with the results from this study is that the nesting sites are not in the activity centers of them over the active season. So they are using different areas in order to nest. And whenever we talk about these areas being different, what we have to keep in mind is that we have to conserve all of the different kinds of habitats that the animals need from the eggs through adulthood. The nesting areas are in open habitat with loose friable soils. Although not illustrated here, the turtles have some affinity to go back to places that they nest, and skipping areas that if we put on our turtle hats that look perfectly good to us, but the turtles don't go there. So we have to keep that in mind when we're trying to think about what to protect. And they can be very far away. They could be a mile away from where the animal usually is. Not always, but that happens. And so the habitat conservation concludes here is that the turtles are found in a variety of areas that have this emergent component to them. Frequently, it's an emergent wetland, but it could also be, they are found in streams, but when they're associated with emergent vegetation, typically in those as well. If you want to have a viable population, you need to address all of the different life stage habitat needs. You can't just go after protecting just the adults, because that won't do it. And the nesting habitat is going to be very different from the normal active habitat. In terms of patterns of movement, here is some data of some individual turtles, there's a stream along there. I've modified the image so it's not actually what it looks like, so people can't just figure out where we are. But here's some data for one female, another female, and for a male. And on these images, this image is 6 kilometers across. So these are animals that are traveling potentially several miles. Here's 2 females that we didn't document that laid eggs, and one of these occupied just a very small stretch of stream. Here's another one that occupied a little larger area. Here's a couple more individual females that we do know that they nested, so nesting over here and over here. And so they traveled quite a ways out of where they normally were. But then let's throw in a couple males. One male here is occupying an area very similar to one of the females. And then here's another male that traveled quite a bit further. Now, what I will say about this is there is, even though it's suggested by the one male that traveled a pretty substantial difference, we're not seeing any kind of regular pattern in terms of males traveling larger distances, but it just happens to be an extreme that fit into what we're showing you today. But that's 3 miles. So these turtles, when they can, they will travel very far. Here's just a set of points of turtles, a number of turtles in one of the study sites. And right here is an overwintering area, a cluster, and then right here is another one. And the point of this is that the turtles may very well cluster and specialize and find these sites to overwinter that meet their needs in terms of a shallow, still water and a muddy bottom. But then they travel away from there. So knowing where the overwintering sites are also important. If you don't protect nesting sites, you got a problem. If you don't protect overwintering sites, you have another problem. So movement conservation conclusions. Blandings turtles are one of the species that can travel pretty far, and you have to factor that in. They're going to need wetland complexes, not only in terms of the movements, but also in terms of making sure that they have all of the habitat they need. There's going to be barriers that need to be addressed. You need to mitigate those barriers so that the animals can get around. And if you have one area that's protected and another area that's not, the turtles can't read, so they don't know where the signs are that tell them to stop. They just keep right on going. And so you have to think of them across the landscape, not just in areas that are protected. The nesting habitat can be very different and be far away. And so it needs to be managed differently. And the turtles need to be able to get there. Again, it's about barriers and corridors. All right, so there, you know everything about Blandings turtles now. And I'm happy to take questions, and there you have some contact information for me.
Thank you, Bruce. That was very informative. We do have a question in the Q&A. George's question was, has anyone observed associations between turtle nesting and livestock concentrations or trampling? He's been wondering if they evolved to look for nesting sites in soils broken up or trampled by large herbivores.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not aware of anything like that. What I do think they learn over time, you know, think about the fact that they live for many decades. They learn where sites are. They don't necessarily sort out why they're like that. So you could have trampling issues. If you have a pile of sand, the turtles find it and they like it, but maybe it's being used for construction. So that the turtles may not be able to discriminate and could get themselves into trouble.
I know when you talked about turtles and all these different habitats, it made me think of the wildlife corridors that you think of out west, all those ones that are being constructed. Is there anything like that being thought of for turtles? Because I know people stop and try to take those turtles off the road, and I know turtles can't read signs, but is there anything that we've been thinking about or talking about in terms of management for these turtles, of trying to make some sort of safe crossing areas for them?
Well, roads are a challenge. Well, in the research we've done on various types of reptiles, roads are a very serious challenge, and those kinds of corridors are extremely expensive, and you're lucky if you can get everybody on board to do that. And departments of transportation would like advance notice that might be decades out into the future, and we need to work with them to let them know that these are our hot spots and that it would be nice if we could mitigate a crossing. But a lot of times it's more about making a good habitat between these different areas so that the animals feel safe to cross. And to the extent that we can, we want to mitigate roads for some of these aquatic organisms. That means we can use box culverts and bridges and bring habitat right up to the either side of the road where we want them to cross. And where we don't want them to cross, we put up barriers, or we make the habitat very uninviting and hope that fewer of them actually try to cross there.
Those are some good points. And following up on that, so if a landowner found a Blandings turtle on their property, it sounds like some of the things they could do is not whacking back all the vegetation along the road if possible, but are there any other things that you would suggest to landowners to help protect their Blandings turtles?
Well, I think a lot of Blandings turtles that individuals find on property like that, and when you say landowner, I'm thinking of a private landowner who finds a turtle. A lot of times there, what I would recommend is just enhancing the habitat that's present, trying to identify what the barriers are to the next wetland or the next habitat complex. For land managers, then they have a bigger sandbox to work in, but the approaches are the same. We need to identify barriers and remove them. We need to identify the sensitive habitats like nesting habitat or overwintering habitat corridors and protect and enhance those.
And you just got a great segue into my next question. David asks, how deeply do they overwinter? If folks are working in a wetland, for example, for invasive removal, are the hibernating turtles at risk of our actions?
Well, I do think that there are a variety of species that are vulnerable in the winter. And you could be talking about Massasaugas, you could be talking about spotted turtles, Blandings turtles, and actually those are the species that are somewhat on our radar, but actually there are racers, there's all kinds of things that use habitats where they are getting into by crayfish burrow or actually in open water into areas that they're only a couple of feet deep. I mean, these areas are very shallow. They'll have a mucky bottom frequently that actually the animal can get into, but they're not very deep. And so if we do manipulate water levels so that we lower the water levels and expose those, you can really get a pretty substantial kill. And so if there's a practice, say, of you want to fix your dam, or you want to do invasive plant control, and so you lower the water level a few feet to make it easier to get in there, or to work on that dam structure, you could have a serious kill. And the problem there is that they do concentrate. And so if you have a detrimental effect in a site, you might in fact have quite a powerful negative effect where you're hitting most of the population at one time.
Awesome. I know you showed in some of your slides that you saw both spotted as well as Blandings turtles in some of them. Daniel asks, how common is it to find them in the same wetland?
Well, I would say where they occur and co-occur that would not be uncommon. The problem is there's not very many populations of them to begin with. But where you have that shallow, stable water is where you have juvenile Blandings turtles, and also where you have spotted turtles. So if that kind of habitat is available, then I would expect in southern Michigan that you would find areas where they co-occur, and they might even overwinter not that far from one another.
Awesome. One other question, someone was asking, how about trampling, not water level? I assume they're asking in terms of how that affects the turtle populations. So
perhaps that's coming back to the earlier question, and I hear the distinction there. It does seem that a low level grazing potentially, if it was managed properly, could be beneficial. I'm aware of a population that is persistent in an area that is grazed, and they co-occur. So that would be an interesting thing to look into further. I think if you have high intensity grazing, it's just another kind of a roulette where how many cattle steps does it take to squish a spotted turtle or a Blandings turtle? So I think there's going to be a tipping point that's probably going to be at a fairly low density. And what you really want to do is have your watering facilities isolated from the natural habitat. You want to fence off the habitat that you're trying to protect, so that the cattle can't even get into those areas.
So speaking of fencing, someone had an interesting question and asked, some species of turtle can climb fences? I did not know this, by the way. Do Blandings turtles climb?
I would be surprised that there's a lot of the species can't climb. I think most of them can. I mean, you present them with a barrier, they're going to try to find a solution.
Just like us, right?
Oh yeah, it's like this thing's in my way, I'm going to try to go over it, and they may or may not be that good at it. I mean, I don't know how a Blandings turtle does compared to a snapping turtle, but a lot of these guys will climb.
All right, I'm going to go with one more question before we move on. Sarah asks, is it known if Blandings and spotted turtles interbreed?
I don't think they do.
Okay, that's okay. It brings up a lot of great thoughts. Well, thank you so much, Bruce. I think we're going to switch to our next speaker, but I really appreciate you spending your time with us today.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. All right.